So in the second part of my interview with Ivor Davis, he talks about being on tour with the Beatles on that first American tour. And the big question, the big meeting was, what really happened when the Beatles went to meet Elvis? There've been so many variations. Find out from an objective eyewitness who was there. Now, they came down when they met Elvis?
Yes. Well, that was the next year, yeah.
That was the next
Elvis,
year, wasn't it?
Of course, was 60. Elvis was 65. And, when we went with them to see Elvis, what I didn't know at the time was Elvis was very jealous of them. There's no doubt that because nobody else had challenged him. No. Nobody else had challenged his triumph. And these guys from Liverpool had. They knocked him off the hit parade. They made one movie, A Hard Day's Night, and it was a success. Elvis churned out 3 movies a year, the same movie with different leading lady, different song. Yeah. And Elvis was very, very upset. And then when Elvis finally, Parker and John wanted to meet Elvis more than anyone. When Parker and Brian got together and they had them come together, and finally they came to the house. It came 1 week or so after Elvis had never done a live concert since he came back from his military service, and so Elvis had seen that they were at Shea Stadium a week earlier, 10 days earlier, to a sellout crowd, and Elvis was pissed.
Yeah,
yeah, and I think it showed. As we watched, you're like at the fly on the wall, watched them perform, and he really didn't give them a big welcome. And it was it was testy in a non-confrontational way. And the funny thing is, I'm doing a program at my local museum, and I looked at a piece of film of George and all the boys talking about the Elvis meeting, and it was done for the anthology, which I think Neil and Derek Taylor put together. And all of a sudden, this rather complicated meeting with Elvis, which really was not a great success in my mind. Yeah. All of a sudden, the Beatles said, "Oh, we loved Elvis, and he did this and that. It was the greatest moment in our life." Rubbish. They had just. It wasn't a great meeting. That's all I can say.
Yeah, I've read various accounts of what it was like, and it was awkward for a long time. Sort of, it's one of those things that you try and meet your heroes, and I think because they'd loved 1950s Elvis, the rock and roll Elvis,
yes,
and now, as you say, that the guy they're getting to see is like a different person completely.
Okay. Well, they knew. John said to me. As you know, John was in risk of being called up in the military to do his national service. And John, I remember, said to me, we were talking about Elvis, and he thought Elvis going into the military for 2 years was a tremendous handicap to his career, because Elvis didn't perform. Elvis didn't perform for the troops. Elvis was a high-profile American soldier doing his bit. And John said, and I believe him, he said, if they called me up, I would have emigrated and run away to the south of Ireland. And I believe him. So anyway, so the whole Elvis, John loved Elvis, and John said that he used to sit, as I did, and people of my ilk, with a transistor radio to my ear, listening to Radio Luxembourg, Heartbreak Hotel, Blue Suede Shoes, because the BBC back then didn't play that kind of music.
No, exactly.
Yeah, so all those elements add up to Elvis not being really keen to meet the Beatles.
Yeah,
and I think that's and it showed. Believe me, in the room, he wasn't. He didn't have the skills to get up and say hi, and nobody introduced the Beatles to Elvis. It was kind of like awkward. 10 minutes of awkwardness. And what do? You walk in the house. I think the boys had a few puffs of marijuana on the way up, so they were feeling no pain. And in fact, on the way up, I think, what was the name of the driver? I forget his name now. The Beatles driver got lost.
Alf Bicknell.
Alf, yeah. Alf got lost because in those days they didn't have get onto your iPhone and say, how do you get to Elvis's house? Here's the address. So they got lost and they got there and they were a little bit high. And Elvis was not what was not the perfect mind host.
Yeah. So it's awkward, but they eventually got some instruments out, didn't they?
Yeah, they eventually ended up because Elvis had a great sense of humor. He had a very good sense of humor, and as the evening wore on with conversation, they talked about Peter Sellers and Dr. Strangelove, which I think had just come out, and the Beatles loved that movie, and that movie is great with Sellers playing four different roles. So there was, they did click, but it took a long time. And Elvis had said, I thought you guys came here to play, otherwise I'm going to bed, so that kind of broke the ice. But Elvis did have a good sense of humor. There's no doubt, a wry sense of humor. And in a way that was the kind of the lifeline to them managing to finish the evening together.
And of course, that means what you witnessed was the two biggest artists of the 20th century in a room together, performing together, Elvis and the Beatles.
Yes. But don't forget, as I say, what I didn't realize was that there's this underlying resentment that Elvis had for the Beatles, because he goes into the army, comes out, he's not as big as he used to do, he's making crappy movies, the Beatles make one movie, and all those swirling, I didn't know that at the time, but that explains Elvis's early coolness to the boys, because Elvis didn't say, I want to meet the Beatles. John wanted to meet Elvis, and Parker put it together with Brian. They were the instigators of this summit, if you want to call it that. And the participants of the summit, except for John, weren't particularly, the other Beatles wanted to meet Elvis, but Elvis, a key participant, wasn't too warm to the idea.
Yeah, it's more of it's a good PR exercise.
That's right.
And the Colonel.
Parker was a PR carny man. He was a carnival Parker. Well, we all know. Parker knew. I've got to give it to him. He's still suffering from several black eyes, but he was very shrewd in demanding big money for Elvis, which actually Brian wasn't.
So tell me about these games of Monopoly.
Well, the interesting thing was that John obviously was a bit of an insomniac. I don't know how he did it or when he was able to sleep. Yeah, I know. We would go in, me, Arthur Schreiber, who was a Westinghouse American correspondent, a lovely man, still around.
Met Art. Yeah.
You met Arthur. Okay. So Arthur's a lovely guy. Arthur was, you can't make this stuff up. Arthur was Westinghouse's #1 political correspondent, And then he gets a call from his editor saying, I want you to travel with the Beatles. He didn't know who the Beatles were. He didn't have a clue. He didn't know anything about music. And so what happens is he leaves his job as political correspondent and joins the Beatles. And he's a nice guy, a very pleasant guy. You've met him.
Yeah.
And he suddenly becomes John's political advisor, because John is fascinated by what's going on in America as we're traveling through. There was race riots, the Vietnam War, and Arthur Schreiber covered John Kennedy's election and all the civil rights campaigns with Martin Luther King. And so John wanted, like a sponge, wanted to absorb what Arthur had to say. And Arthur was his educator, his professor, his American history guy, and spent a lot of time talking about the civil rights and about Kennedy's, because don't forget, it was less than a year after John Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963 that the Beatles were in America. Yeah. And by the way, when we were in Dallas, John wanted to go to Dealey Plaza where Kennedy was assassinated, and Brian said no. Brian said it could be a negative connotation. The country was raw with anguish and pain. Less than a year later, and there was a rock and roll guy showing up with media to the Dealey Plaza assassination site. So Brian said, don't go. And Brian said, don't go. And I think in retrospect, it was right. But the fact that we were in Dallas, maybe 3 miles, 4 miles from Dealey Plaza, and John never got to go. Mind you, the Beatles never got to go anywhere because, they were stuck and trapped in the hotels.
Yeah. Did they talk to you about that theme of being trapped?
Not really, but John said to me, I remember in the last few days, I said, how did you enjoy America? He said, we didn't really see it. And it's true. They never got, I mean, when we were in Vegas, there was no way they could leave the hotel because, I could walk out and go down the strip. But the Beatles, had they left the hotel, would have been maybe torn, shred limb from limb. So they were very, very kind of a bit annoyed at being constrained. Yeah. But on the other hand, if they'd left, there were mob scenes. The only time they ever left, I mean, when we were in Texas, I remember, I forget where it was, but that Neil was able to go out and buy cowboy gear for them, but they never went they never went shopping. The only time they had the freedom of their own was 2/3 of the way through, near the end, I think it was, when they went to this dude ranch owned by Reed Pigman. And Reed Pigman, as you know, was the owner of the Electrojet company that rented the Beatles. So he took them out for Brian's birthday for 3 days at the ranch, and they had they were kids all again, and they go-karted and horseback rode, and but they were prisoners. That's all.
Yeah, that must have been so tough for them. And as you say, they were out there in America and didn't see anything but the inside of a plane, inside of a limo, inside of a hotel.
That's right. I mean, you travel across America and Canada and you don't see anything. You see the same stuff. And it's like, I don't know, I can't think of a comparison, but can you imagine visiting any Australia or any country and not seeing anything? I mean, the whole idea, and you see exactly what you just said, the hotel, the limousine, the airplane, the airport. It's really abnormal.
Yeah,